So hello, and thank you for joining us for a discussion on evaluating when it's time to tackle technical debt. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Bugsnag. The webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the lead dev Slack channel to answer some of your questions in the technical-dev channel. So let's get started with some introductions. I am Blanca Garcia Gil, and I work as a principal engineer at the BBC. And today I'll be joined by Maud Lemaire, author and staff software engineer at Slack. She's wearing the blue top. Rodney Cobb, who's wearing the smart blue shirt. He's a senior DevOps engineer at The Atlantic. And James Smith, the CEO and co-founder of Bugsnag, with the fancy background and the amazing bookcase. So I'm going to introduce the topic a little bit, and I'm wondering if you've ever seen the faces of either panic or total lack of interest after you have mentioned the words technical debt at a senior leadership meeting. It's literally like pouring a bucket of ice water over them. On the other hand, addressing tech debt with engineering teams feels like killing the joy at the party and putting a hard brake to delivering features for them. But as we grow through our technical careers and get to grips with very complex code bases, we realize we need to put time into keeping them healthy and know when and how to call something out. Our jobs become more of translators of technical complexity to people in business roles, and at the same time as influencers to engineering teams to motivate them for the need of this work. In this panel, we'll go over on how you go about identifying what is technical debt and what techniques you can use to communicate the benefits of tackling it across the organization and the positive impact it can have further down the line. So let's begin with coming together as a group and share our views on what is tech debt. How would you sum that up in a one sentence or two? If you don't mind starting, maybe James?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's the Webster's dictionary definition of tech debt, but in reality, I think it's choices that are intentional or unintentional that you have to deal with later and may cause problems. But it's not always bad. I don't think technical debt is bad. Sometimes it's okay to go into debt to make a large purchase in the finance world. The same is true when it comes to building software as well. So some people say the negative consequences of, but I think it's intentional work that you do that you have to clean up later.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Maud? What are your thoughts?
I totally agree. I think the other thing is something that you mentioned that's really interesting is like, it's whether intentional or not. I think, yeah, there's a conscious piece sometimes where you're writing something and you're like, I'm aware that I'm writing this for now, and that is okay. There's also times that you're writing something within the constraints of now, and you're not aware that maybe down the line it won't work, because I think a lot of technical debt is brought about by changes in requirements, whether that's changes in the number of users using your product, right? And so suddenly the requirements are, it needs to be much more performant than you thought it needed to be, or changes in requirements from the product side, right? The product team is coming up with completely new ways and visions for your product. And so like you have to completely shift the way your code was written to accommodate some new changes. So requirement shifts are a huge part of causing tech debt where there wasn't some prior in a lot of ways. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it too.
And Rodney, what is your view and your experience on this? You're on mute.
I'm sorry. I think both of those descriptions are very apt. I mean, in essence, we can say it's the work that you got to do tomorrow because you took a shortcut in order to deliver something today, right? And making those analogies to the to the financial world is very true. Like James was talking about, sometimes you put an investment, you want to go into debt here. I'm going to buy the house and I'm going to go into debt, but later on, I'm going to get a huge return on this. Now, I don't think any one of us want to go into that much of a technical debt. But I think there is a balance that you must strike between the product world and what they want to have delivered versus what we can competently deliver in that finite space of time. And then, of course, talking to your engineers and seeing what can be pushed to the side and what cannot. But we can get into the more complex things later.
Well,
Definitely, I totally agree with all of you. I think that tactical work, as it's kind of talked sometimes in my job, tends to bring later on, tasks to kind of address the kind of the things that you just didn't have enough time to make. Go on, James.
I was just thinking about that. There's we talked about the intentional, unintentional, and sometimes it's an investment, but there's also, I think, a layer of technical debt, which is I like to call it bit rot. Where you have something that was perfectly designed, and yet you just work on that file over time or whatever it is and just keep adding on things. And we had one at my previous company, which had a big Ruby on Rails web app, and there was a model called user.rb that had survived through 3 company pivots. So from being a B2B app to a consumer app to a B2B app again, and there was literally an ASCII art dragon at the top of the file in a comment to kind of warn you, here be dragons, because maybe at one point it was a perfectly designed file, but by the time I left the company, absolutely not. I think that's the other one that sometimes gets missed. It sneaks up on you.
And to piggyback on that, when engineers copy and paste from other repos to try to just try to stay in line as much as they can with the paradigm or whatever we have established in coding, that bit rot really starts to stack up then, because when we refactor those other repos that they copied and paste from, the one that final repo never gets changed. It never gets refactored. So then you look at it 6 months. Literally, I was just doing this morning. That's why I can say it. Literally this morning, something broke Fresh. Because a repo had been left lonely like a lamb, and it was just horrible. But yeah, bit rot is one of those situations where unintentional, but sometimes organically happens.
And I think mentioning that bit rot leads very nicely to my next question. Is that bit rot part of tech debt? Is that very different to legacy software? Is there an overlap, or are they just completely separate?
I feel like it causes the same emotional impact down the line. You end up with, if one way to look at technical debt, I'm sure we'll have some different perspectives here, but one way to look at a technical debt is, how does it make you feel as a development team? And sometimes you end up with people who aren't software engineers or engineering managers saying, oh, why are they moaning about technical debt? All I'm hearing is moaning. But actually it's a trailing indicator, but it is a symptom. And if you see that same symptom happening with long-term technical debt like bit rot or legacy code bases, or kind of intentional decisions that you've made, or crazy refactors or whatever, it still ends up in the same situation and the same feeling. And so I personally put them in the same category. I feel like that they're subcategories of technical debt because they lead to the same emotional impact.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like I've seen so many engineers just burn out because of kind of this kind of tsunami, what I call of kind of legacy that falls onto them, and you just become really overwhelmed very quickly. So it's key to tackle it quite fast. Okay, cool. So I'm now gonna ask questions directed to each of you, just because I'm curious, okay, of the things you get up to in your day-to-day jobs. And I'm gonna start with you, Maud, if you don't mind. So you work at Slack, and we all know how amazing the Slack is, but internally, is it a hard sell to convince people to address technical debt and evaluate the priority, and how do you frame those conversations to make a business case?
Yeah, so thankfully Slack is still very, I would say it's much easier of a sell to do technical debt type projects at Slack than at other software companies, at least the ones that I've worked at and some of the coworkers that I've had that they've worked at. What's really great is that the product teams and the engineering teams really work closely together. And I think a lot of the product teams are really technically minded. And so they have more of this understanding of this is the importance of technical debt. I think part of what really helps also is the product we sell is software. And so that is the main focus of the business. And our technical leadership is very mindful of that. And we need to be up and running 100% of the time, right? Like Slack just needs to have that level of reliability. And so like to have that, you can't just not care about technical debt. Like this isn't, you know, some other random, like software is the main core of the business. It's not some smaller sub piece of the business. So it's really, really critical. And I think there's like a really good understanding of that. One thing that I can't recommend enough though, when you're trying to sell a technical debt project of some kind, right? Because like there's this sort of, you mentioned it, we're trying to be translators for management in some ways of like, this is the technical debt over here. This is what it's like in this part of the world. And we're trying to translate that up to managers who have a much more abstracted out view of the world. And one thing that's really important is I always try to set up meetings with like managers, skip levels, and have conversations with them about like, what are you most concerned about in the next 6 months? What are you most concerned about over the next year? And frame the technical debt projects that I want to do in that lens. And so if they really care about reliability, that is the #1 thing on their roadmap for the next year, then I'm going to take whatever technical debt project I want to do and frame it in the sense of, oh, I think it's going to help us with reliability in these ways if we address this specific problem. And then their ears just perk up immediately. They care a lot more when you're able to frame it in the terms of the things that they care about. And just talking to your teammates, talking to people in your broader team, not just your immediate team, that's always a really great way to find out about other projects, other issues that other people have in the code base that you might not be aware of, or realize that you've both been hating on the same file for years now and you had no idea, and now you can like team up and come up with a plan. But no plan is going to be convincing unless you can properly quantify and measure it. That's the biggest thing. You can't just, come up to management with a bunch of words and be like, yeah, I think it'll help reliability because I feel it. And it's the feeling I have. Like you have to do the actual legwork and go in and measure. And I spent a little bit over the last year writing a book about everything that I've learned refactoring these really, really big projects at Slack. And I have an entire chapter in there about like different ways that you can measure the impact of refactoring and what you want to refactor and why. Try to quantify the problem. Why is this a problem? Because if you don't actually understand the problem really well, you might end up fixing something completely different, which is not good. That's not where you want to end up. And it's not just code complexity or like test coverage, right? Like there's a bunch of different ways you can go about measuring that that are in a lot of ways much more convincing to management than, pulling out your Halstead metrics.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's I think I'll be definitely reading the book because I could add some more tricks. Sounds like you're a master networker in your company, and definitely relationships do help as well as data.
They're huge. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So, we're gonna move on to Rodney. And I see you're now working for the Atlantic. So I don't know how much. I see that more as a media organization than perhaps a tech company. So. How do you go about convincing engineering teams? And are more diverse teams perhaps more resilient? Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, so I'm not at the Atlantic anymore. I'm actually at Remind Incorporated.
Oh,
it's
sorry.
a realtor. It's a realtor company. No, you're fine. It's a realtor company. And really, I usually try to frame it in the sense of, do you want 20% of your time back, right? Like the way you would frame it to like a CTO or someone in the C-suite, or do you want 20% of your budget back? So really it's about your looking at time as a measurement of a resource, right? Like each one of us, our time is a resource, and that resource has a metric to it. It has a quantifiable number that goes along with it. And do you want some of that back to either A, work on projects that are more appealing, B, to do more the evil word documentation on the stuff that you've already done, because none of us like doing it, or do you want that time back to level up your skill level? And usually what I usually try to scope it in terms of is, hey, look, we're going to do this to get 20% of our time back, so that now you as an engineer can level up. You can get better at what you're doing. Because at the end, a lot of times at the end of the day, we all want to get better. We all want every day, I think Every engineer I know, every day we're trying to get 1% better. So that's usually the way that I try to go about convincing them. And then on the question of diverse teams and resiliency to it, I think diversity in thought and diversity in paradigm is always a great asset to have in any situation, especially in engineering. And having individuals who think about it in a different way. So me, James, and Maud might, we may all look at a given problem, and we may all three of us come out with three different routes or paths in which to solve it. And to me, that's a great thing. I think about engineering more in a kind of an existentialist kind of format. So it's very organic. We're all artists, and every art has its own value, right? And so if all three of us come together and we are all working on, let's look at a project as an overall canvas, as a painting or a mural, and we all see three different ways in which to do this. If we come together and then kind of combine those paths together, then you come out with something that is, completely amazing, right? You come out with, as we were talking about earlier before we started live. We're talking about Washington, D.C. and the inauguration today. D.C. had several architects, Benjamin Banneker, LaFont, several different people who came in, and all of those individuals contributed to create, this beautiful piece of art. And so I look at engineering much in the same way. And I think that if you have that diversity of thought, you have a better chance of at least somebody in the group saying, hey, man, maybe we should write this test. Or maybe, or maybe that's not a good reason for us to incur this kind of technical debt. And so, having that diversity in the room is very, very good, for sure.
Yeah, I love the analogy that you mentioned about the canvas and seeing a code base as kind of like a working and evolving thing, and where everyone contributes. I think that's a lovely concept. Like, I just pictured it in my mind.
Because we're artists, we got to embrace that. We got to embrace the artist in all of us.
Definitely. And do you have any tips, Rodney? Like, is there anything you think engineering teams can do at the start of a project to kind of prevent the tech debt just like getting out of hand very quickly?
Right. Well, first of all, I definitely think in my past, we've always had a practice of what are the good reasons for incurring tech debt and what are the bad reasons. And at the beginning of each project, making sure that we line those up with what we need to do. Like, bad reasons are always like, oh, I don't want to do this because this thing is more interesting over here. Or, you know what? Yeah, I could write test coverage for this, but it's only going to be here for a minute, so we're going to blow this up. So let me not even worry about it. Like, those are bad reasons. The good reasons, if you try to stick to them, of saying, yes, I know that if I write this portion to fulfill putting in a button or a new feature that an end user wants, I know that I need to do this within this given sprint by the end of the week. And I know that next week I'm going to have to come back and write test coverage and do these things. Those are good reasons. Those are okay. And as long as we establish a structure or a process around, okay, what are our good reasons? What are the reasons we don't want to do it? And then we stay rigid to that. Everyone, I'm pretty sure all of us have dealt with, C-suite members, founders coming in and saying, oh, you know what? I really think this is cool. I really want this. And scope creep comes in, and then next thing you know, you're off on something else. But being really rigid and being really, really steadfast in talking to product and talking to C-suite members and saying, no, we're not going to break our sprint up for this one particular feature or for this one thing. What we can do is we can try to incorporate it into what we're already doing. You have to be, the good thing and the bad thing about engineers is we don't know how to say no. If you come ask me to do something, I think I can solve any problem as long as I'm at this keyboard. That's a bad thing. And so it's really about training ourselves not to always be, oh yeah, I can build that. Oh yeah, I can do that. Because I mean, I guarantee if you ask any one of us right now, he will, can you build this? Do it, and we'll all say yes, every last one of us, knowing that it will probably, create some ripples and some obstacles along the way. But because we love what we're doing, we want it. Just like I said, just like the artist. You ask the artist to paint a mural on the side of their building, he's going to do it, even though he got 12 other projects he's doing.
Yeah, I could definitely look back in my career and be like, yeah, I've been this person. But it goes back to the start of the conversation where Mo mentioned the changing requirements. So that it's really good that you say at the beginning of the project, just like get everyone together, say why you're doing something, what you're not doing, and just stick to it. And it definitely will help. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to you, James, because you have a bit of a different experience that I'm very curious about. You founded your own company and you've scaled it. And I was wondering, does the maturity of the company or product you're working on impact the decisions about when you tackle that tech debt?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, my background is I have a math and CS degree. I was a software engineer for a long time. Then I snuck my way into management and was a CTO at my previous company. And then now I'm running a company, but kind of like Maud said earlier, my company builds software for my company builds software for software developers. And so I've kind of stayed in there, even though I'm a CEO now, I kind of can claim that I'm a retired software engineer. But absolutely, look, when we started the business, when it was my co-founder and I in a bedroom hacking this thing together, we wanted to get features to market as soon as possible. We didn't know if anyone would buy this thing, would pay for this thing, if anyone gave a crap about this thing that we were building. And so it didn't matter if it was a little bit buggy. In some core areas of the app, if we wanted to get people to use it and tell their friends about it, obviously we wanted it to be a good experience. But people are forgiving. Do you remember Gmail had the beta tag at the top of it for like 10 years? That's a great way to say, hey, it's not going to be great. Don't complain at us. And so you definitely get away with a lot at the early stages of the company, and arguably that's the right way to build a business. You need to fail fast and figure out if this is what people want, because otherwise you're going to be spending time to crib Rodney's analogy here, making this beautiful work of art that nobody likes. Maybe you're not ready, the people in the world is not ready for your art style yet. And so but if you get to the later stages of the business, we're not like a super mature company. We're in the middle somewhere, but just kind of like Maud said, our product has to be available. We are monitoring other people's software, and so we cannot go down. We cannot have bugs in our stack. And so at this stage, we have contracts with large companies, and we have SLAs signed with large companies that say we are available 99 point blah 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 % of the time. And so yeah, we take a lot of care in that, and make sure that we measure very carefully the impact of technical debt. And I think that's I don't know, I'm sure that's something area we can talk about as well in more breadth. The measurement of things, I think, is quite crucial, because it's not only good for striking that balance, but I think it's also good for aligning with, as Rodney said earlier, with the other areas of the organization, the product team, the boss, in some cases. Okay, this is the goal that we agreed upon. So yeah, it definitely is a slider from small company to large company. But in large companies, you end up with what Rodney was talking about, where you have legacy code bases and refactoring them, and you end up with people coming in saying, "Oh gosh, what is this? Okay, let's start again." But yeah, set the slider depending on how aggressive you want to be with new features and roadmap.
Okay, so do you find now that people come to you to sell you this tech debt and be like, "Hey, James, we have to tackle this"? And are you the one calling the shots now?
I am absolutely not. I think that I'm enough removed from the code base that people would not trust my opinion on that matter. But my co-founder certainly gets that conversation. My co-founder is our CTO, and I saw someone in chat asked about, what percentage of time do you allocate to these things? I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to that. Just like we said earlier, it depends on the size scale of the business, the age of the code base, all sorts of stuff. But carving out some time is important, and if you do that, you can constrain the prioritization. So my co-founder's engineering managers will come to him and say, here are the tech debt projects we want to work on this sprint or this quarter, mostly this quarter. And then those managers will go to their team and do exactly what Maud suggested, and do skip levels and check-ins and meetings and retrospectives, and say, okay, what were the problems that we incurred, and are we okay with them, or do we want to develop those? So if you set up what Maud suggested, and have that regular communication flow, it shouldn't be this like, please can we work on these big scary projects? It should be like, okay, we've identified that as an engineering team, these are our priorities. And then that manager then can go to the CTO and say, our engineering team has identified these are the problems. And if you additionally teach everyone how to talk about ROI, this is why it's good for the business, it shouldn't become this like horrible, scary moan. It will be something that is easy and natural to talk about. It's hard to get there, but it's worth investing in.
It's interesting that you brought kind of that return of investment and the engineering team surfacing that things need to be addressed in order to shift priorities. Because my next question was about how do you manage that translation between, business says, I want features, and the team says, you need to address this before you even get started with that.
Yeah, on the measurement side of things, I think that really helps. I think there's a risk that you can get too invested in measurements that maybe don't matter. I see people talking about code coverage when it comes to technical debt. You can have really crappy code that has perfect code coverage. It's very easy for that to happen. And so if you're like, great, we have 100% code coverage, that doesn't necessarily matter. I think there's some good metrics pre and post production. Cyclomatic complexity is another code smell techniques are quite good pre-production, and make sure that you're not continually incurring technical debt. But I mean, I'm biased here because we build a company around this, but we have this concept of what we call stability scores, which is effectively another word for error rate, the inverse of an error rate. And the idea there is it's a number that you can compare apples to apples between code bases and should be understandable by the product team or the business team. So you can say, look, our stability is 99.5%. You say, oh, great, good work, everyone. Well, no, actually, that's not great. You're 5 in every 1,000 customers seeing a crashed experience. And you say that to a tech company, they'll get it. You say that if you're an e-commerce company, if you're like a supermarket, and you say that to the CEO, they're going to understand you don't want to block 5 out of every 1,000 people from coming in the front door. That's a bad thing. So measuring and then translating even what the measurement means, and not going super in the weed with abstract concepts is always good as well. Like the CEO is not going to care about the cyclomatic complexity of a particular part of the code base. That doesn't matter. But the CEO will care about our checkout experience is at this stability level, and we want to aim to get it up to this, or whatever metric you want to use. I'm using that one because I'm familiar with it.
Mm-hmm. No,
and we used to use outages. I'm sorry. I was just saying we used to use outages as a great measurement. Because like you said, outages means that no one is coming to whatever product I have. And so that means I'm not making any kind of revenue, especially in an ads-based situation where you have, clickable impressions and viewable impressions. If no one can get to that, well, then that means it's zero, right? Like that's how much money you make. You may not be able to tell how much money you make in an hour if your site is up, but if it's down, what you're making, which is nothing. So usually that's always, like you said, a measurement that you can take to management and say, hey, you know what, here's the quantifiable number that I can give you.
Yeah, I take that. And I think for me, the big thing that over the last maybe couple of years has been not just measuring, but showing kind of longer term trends and saying, back maybe 6 months ago or a year ago, this was what good looked like, but now we've moved on, and you have to kind of show the impact of changes and say like, but these are kind of the targets that would look okay now. And I think that's what you described, James, with your company growing. You start, with a lot of room for maybe, not just failure, but just like your customers are very forgiving. And then as you grow and you have big contracts and you have this kind of reliability and SLAs, you're like, oh, I can't really live with that anymore. But I find that some people, it's, when I have conversations, it's easy to get stuck in the numbers, and they're like, oh, but you said, number 11 was good and we are 8. And you have to then kind of drop a level down and be like, yeah, but I'm going to explain to you why maybe that 8 is still okay now, even though it's not like the perfect thing. And yeah, it's tricky. Okay, so back to you, Maud.
Okay, I have something to add on to
cool.
this thread, if that's all right, before we jump into something else. But incidents and outages, definitely like really obvious, really big ones. One thing that I really love to do is look at postmortems. We now call them incident reviews at Slack, but look at the action items or the contributing factors and see how often the contributing factors come back up across a number of different incidents. Doesn't have to be a full outage, but if they come back up, like, you know, there's something there that you have to fix. Like, we've all been there. We're all engineers. Like, we know that like there's those things that always come back, and like we know what went wrong. And let's just be honest with ourselves, right? Like, they're there for a reason. And I love the whole incident review process. I think it's a really great place to look for really impactful technical debt to tackle. But one level like more nefarious than that is just like general slower velocity. And I think especially, so when I started at Slack, it was 4.5 years ago, and we were, I don't know, like 100 something engineers, and now we're like pushing 800, and like it's changed quite a bit. And there's been this perception that like we've slowed down in some places, and we're not really sure where the slowdown comes from in a lot of cases, and that's the really tricky technical debt to identify. And one thing that I started doing a couple years ago was going through Slack. So I work at Slack, so I use Slack a lot, and using Slack search to try to find all of the times that someone had the same question about the same stupid piece of code to try to show that this piece of code is a huge problem, because we have wasted probably like 20 engineer hours over the last 3 months in threads where people are trying to explain what the heck this piece of code is doing. If we just fix it now, we'll stop having those questions, and then we'll be able to move faster. So finding the trend of questions that people keep asking in various engineering channels, and then seeing like, look, there's timestamps, right? There's literal timestamps of like the conversation started here and it ended here, and we spent 3 hours talking about what the heck this piece of code did. That's a huge waste of time if we can just fix it and make it better. So there's a lot of like, and looking at comments in the code are so informative, right? Like, you get to a place, and James mentioned this, of like, this is the terrible file, please don't touch this, have a nice time. That's a huge indicator as well. Onboarding materials, if you have them or they're missing, what's missing can be really indicative as well. Just look at the opposite of what's there. Or, you know, onboarding materials that show like, oh, like, good luck if you're reading this part of the code, like, we need to make it better. And you see the last time that like document has been edited, and it's like 2 years ago, and you're like, oh shoot, like, it's probably much worse now. There's like a lot of subtle ways to measure all this stuff.
No, I think, you know, I'm taking so many notes here to just kind of use things a different way. Using Slack for reporting on things, I find that fascinating, and probably quite, you know, time intensive for you as well. But, you know,
you get faster at it over time too. And you end up chasing down the leans that you really only think in the end are going to matter. I think one thing that happens to me a lot is like, I'll be chasing down a lead of like, I think this is probably a problem. Like, you get that gut feel, or you talk to someone, you're like, I think this is a problem, right? And you start down this path of documenting, measuring why you think it's a problem. And then you realize partway through, you're like, okay, no, like, this isn't worth it. Like, there's 20 other things we should be working on. Like, you just drop it. Or like, you went through the whole process of documenting everything, and then you shop it around to other people on your team. They're like, I don't know that this is like the biggest thing we should be tackling right now. And you're like, okay, yeah. And you drop it. And like, the work that you put in, it will still be valuable at some point. It's just like, you know, you're reprioritizing all the time. One of my favorite engineers at work, like, comes in every day and he asks himself, like, what is the most impactful thing I can be working on today? And I like really try to emanate that. I like don't manage to do it every day because, you know, it's hard to do, but aspirations.
Wow. And, you know, because we're talking about, you know, reprioritization, how did you kind of package that? Because as Rodney mentioned earlier, engineers, we say yes to everything. You know, there's always like a, you know, a side of a perfectionist inside. So you begin like wading through that code base, and then you're like, oh, I'm just going to rewrite this entire thing. It's going to look amazing. How do you manage to like hold the fort there?
I mean, I think Rodney touched on it really well, is that like you make a deliberate plan, shop it around, and then like stick to it. It's really important to do that. Like there's a reason why you made that plan to begin with. And once you get to the point where it's really tempting to expand on it, remind yourself that you made a deliberate plan, as tempting as it is. I think there's a lot of, so one of the things that my book touches on is like these really, really large refactors that like span most of the code base, or at least like a really important structural piece. And those can feel like they drag on forever because you have to do these really deliberate sort of in-between phases to make sure that the whole system stays up, everything stays fine. And you're not at any point like just taking out the Jenga piece that will lead the whole tower to fall over. You know, you need to be taping around all the Jenga pieces while you're reorganizing them. And those sort of glue pieces and abstractions above everything else can seem really tedious and tiresome and annoying when you're like, oh, I just want to get to the end product. Like if I could just, you know, shut down the entire service for 2 weeks and rewrite it, like that'd be great. But like realistically, you can't do that. So all of those middle glue pieces are really, really important. You can't cut any corners there, even though they feel like they're superfluous in a lot of ways. So I think like properly planning for those and like stepping back from the temptation of not doing them is really, really important. It takes a lot of self-awareness and being mindful of that. And then the other thing that I found really useful in practice is finding milestones that are meaningful on their own on the path to the full refactor. And I use a road trip analogy in my book for this, of like, you're not going to decide to drive from California to New York without sleeping or stopping to gas up or eat. That, first of all, you're not going to make it. Second of all, that's like just dangerous. And you have to, and if you're going to make that trip, might as well like stop and see something interesting along the way, so that you make the journey just meaningful on its own, besides actually getting to your destination. Like it's entirely cliched, I'm like perfectly aware of this, but it's really important because you also, especially with these like really long-term refactors, you never know if suddenly something is going to shift dramatically in your organization, whether that's like engineering focused or product focused. You need to have like a deliberate, good stopping point where you can be like, okay, I'm comfortable pausing here. Like we've reached a really important milestone. We've net improved a significant piece of this code, but like some other priority came in and we really need to shift gears and go back to that. And you've tidied up enough that like you're in the solid place that you can come back later and finish it up.
Yeah, on back-end applications, we have there's some code in Bugsnag that I wrote still running somewhere, and that's not been pulled. It's probably terrible. That's not been pulled out yet because it's not in a key area of the business. And sometimes it's okay to segment and say that can be terrible. We'll leave that over there because no, it's not important to the company. But one thing I found that my engineering teams did a really good job of is, you know, we started off with two giant apps, a big Rails app and a big Node application. And you can tell when our company was founded by the fact there's a giant Node application. They've been picking off microservices over the years and pulling things into microservices. And sometimes you'll say, right, we're going to pick off this microservice as part of a precursor to doing this feature that we're going to roll out. And by doing that, it will maybe take a little bit longer to roll out this feature, but then you've compartmentalized a piece of your product. And because the ownership and role of these microservices is limited, sometimes during a project you'll say, right, we're going to spin up 3 new services, and maybe you only get 1 or 2 done before you can go into that project, but then you've delivered some meaningful improvement, exactly what Maud's saying. And so yeah, if it's a backend application and you are still a monolithic application, you want to go towards microservices, having someone architect out the big picture and then phasing it out in some way is a really good way to step towards that. Because yeah, even if you just pick off one microservice and the ownership is separated and there's a clear API and you've documented it, then you're probably making progress.
Nice. I'm aware, you know, of the time, so I think this might be the last question that I'm going to ask Rodney, because I think that you've worked in very innovative companies, and I'm just kind of burning to ask you, like, how does tech debt play? Does it work against, or do you think it can actually kind of fuel innovation?
I think that's I think it's a balance in my experience. So yes, and I think I had mentioned this earlier too when we were on an earlier call. You can look at some tech debt as opportunity, right? So we call it tech opportunities. And these opportunities can arise when you're in that situation. You can use a perfect example is what James and Mar were just talking about. You know, you've got this monolithic application and you're trying to push off to microservices, or you're trying to in some way refactor to make yourself a lot more lean and agile. And in those cases, it can become an opportunity and not just a heavy burden of debt. And in a lot of places I've been in, I've been the early adopter, quote unquote. So, you know, I want to try all the new stuff, even if it don't work. I don't care. I want to try all the new stuff. And I can remember specifically when we were moving to AWS, is their Kubernetes service, EKS, from ECS, from their traditional container service. There were, number one, I got talked into it because I wanted to do it. I went to reInvent. The Kool-Aid tastes better when you see them make it. So I was all gung ho for it. I was all ready to do it. I was like, yeah, this is what we're gonna do. And then I got back to the office and they were like, okay, now do it. And so that was really one of those times where we already had an immense amount of tech debt, but we had to take that tech debt that we already have and shave off a percentage of it and just say, okay, here's the opportunities we have now to move to something that's more lean and more automated. From that one migration, we were able to move things over to Helm and get away from Jenkins. We were able to move things over to GitHub Actions and move away from some other integration tests we were running in Jenkins. Like, we were able to do so much to improve our whole deployment process, as well as make ourselves more highly available, more resistant to outages, so forth and so on. So you have to really strike that balance. And anytime you're going into the new, like I call them blue ocean ideas, anytime you're going into those blue ocean ideas, it's always good to look at some of that tech debt as an opportunity. Now we got a chance to do all the things we talked about doing at the beginning, because we all do. Now we got a chance to actually, break this down and make sure it works. And it's exciting, but then a little times it can be stressful as well too.
Wow, that was very, very insightful, and I hope the engineers in my team they're not maybe taking this on, because then tomorrow they're going to be, oh, there's a tech opportunity here. We can just introduce this new thing, and I'm just like, oh no, not yet. Anyhow, we've reached the end of this panel, and I hope this conversation about tech debt or tech opportunity has been able to kind of shift your mind about things and where and see it almost like as part of that product life cycle that we all work on. Really, I have got a lot of notes. I'm definitely going to be having a look at Maud's book. And thank you so much, for all your panelists today. Okay, your insights, your experience, and today's panel. We're going to be taking questions on the Leaf Dev Slack, and it's called #technical-debt. And please join us there. We'll be there, I think, for another 15 minutes or so. And the questions that you pasted here, they're going to be taken over there. So thank you, everyone, and see you on Slack.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Blanca.
Great conversation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.